Hello. I am a deaf professor. I work here at NTID. I teach deaf history and culture. Anyone from my class here? Any of my students? Oh, I see you. I'm so happy to have some of my students here. They're from my American Deaf History class. So I'm very excited to share my research with all of you today, and I'm honored to be presenting on this stage with two other wonderful presenters. My presentation is on a 19th century friendship between two hearing people and a deaf person and what we can learn from that. I'm going to start this presentation with a challenge for you. Now look at these two images up here. And tell me, what kind of source is this? If you're from my class, don't answer this. A letter? Okay. This person thinks a letter. Any other thoughts? A journal? Yep, a journal, writing back and forth. Exactly. That's exactly what this is. It's a handwritten conversation from 1842 between a deaf man and two hearing people. This occurred over a time period from September to December. And this is a very important artifact because many of these handwritten conversations aren't preserved. They're just ripped up and thrown away after their use is no longer needed. So this is just incredible because we have 37 full pages that are well preserved. And that allows us to time travel in a way back to 842 and get a firsthand look into this conversation and how deaf and hearing people interacted in the year 1842. So you might be wondering who these people are. Now, this is a triangular conversation. It's between three people. So I'll provide a short bio on each of the individuals that are involved in this letter. First, we have Carlin, John Carlin. I'll be signing his name like this. Does anyone know who Carlin is? From Gallaudet? Okay, yep, maybe you know his name from there. So Carlin is a famous deaf artist from the 19th century. His specialty was in miniatures and portraits. He became very famous. He painted portraits for senators, governors. One of his commissions was actually for a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, a famous train magnate. So he painted this of his 4 grandchildren. Carlin was born deaf with, quote, no idea of vocal sounds. Carlin doesn't ever remember hearing. He went to Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, and there is where he learned sign language. Oh, we have someone here from Pennsylvania School. Awesome. So again, he never used his voice. He wasn't comfortable. He would sign and write back and forth. He met a deaf woman by the name of Mary Wayland. She was also deaf again, and they had 5 hearing children. Now, their first daughter, her name was Frances Seward Carlin. She was named after this woman. Carlin actually named his first daughters after her, Frances Seward. Now, Frances was a New York girl. She was born and raised here. She was the daughter of a judge, so she was born with money and status. She had access to a great education. She went to the Troy Female Seminary School, and she was also an avid abolitionist. She opened her home to the Underground Railroad, and she also convinced her husband to sell land to Harriet Tubman at a discounted price, their land in Auburn, New York, for the Underground Railroad. Now, the third person here is Henry Seward, Frances's husband. Henry wasn't often home. He was a very busy man. He worked as a lawyer and also got involved in the political world. He was voted state senator in New York twice. then governor of New York, then state representative for New York, and he was Secretary of State under 2 presidents. So he has a very impressive resume. He was a busy guy. Now, that couple is a profoundly hearing couple. How did they become best friends with a profoundly deaf man? So what can we learn from this relationship? Back in the 19th century, how did this relationship evolve and what can we learn from it? I also would like to add that Francis and Henry, they met very few other deaf people, so they didn't know sign. They weren't involved in the deaf community at all. Francis did learn some fingerspelling, very little, but most of the communication between the three was written communication. So you might be wondering how these 3 people met and why their friendship lasted so long. Well, they met in Albany. They were at a government function. And Henry, during that time, he served as the governor of New York back in 1842. And I want to emphasize that Henry, being the governor, meant that he lived in this big mansion with his family. So the Sewards had a hearing publisher editor who knew Carlin, and it was this editor that reached out to Carlin and said, I think you should meet my friends, the Sewards. And they just immediately hit it off. That was the day of the first conversation, 1842, and they've been friends ever since. So these written notes occur primarily in September and October. Now, Carlin would stay in the guest house and then visit the Sewards during the day in their mansion and then go back to the guest house. But he would spend a lot of time with them, and that's when these conversations primarily happened. So if you'll notice from these written communications, it's a bit hard to read. So in a traditional letter, you would have an opening, a closing, body paragraphs, but you might notice that these are a bit all over the place. They're not written in a normal vertical paragraph fashion. So it took a while to make these pages make sense because they're a bit all over the place. I'm sure you're wondering, 37 pages? What were you talking about for 37 pages? Well, I'm going to show you some excerpts from these pages just to kind of give you an idea of what the conversation looked like. I'll give you a chance to read this example here. So they're talking about medical stuff, going to the doctor, some pain they were having. That's one example of the conversation. And then their child, their hearing child, their second oldest, comes up here. The conversation is typically between the 3 adults, but once in a while, a child does come in. As you can see in this example, Carlin was outside playing with the son and a students from my class love this topic here. Obviously, they have some humor in their conversation, right? Carlin says, well, I can't hear what they said. So they talk about some serious topics. They're very open with each other. So you can see Carlin expresses some concerns about being an artist in their conversations. there's any French people here, I'm very sorry. Apparently, Carlin didn't really like French people. His words, not mine. Carlin thought that French people were a bit aloof and phony. Again, his words, not mine. And at this point, you can see Francis asks Carlin, "Are you okay? You seem a bit down." And he says, "Oh no, I'm just thinking about my family." So as you can see, again, these conversations have a wide array of topics. I love teaching this in my deaf studies class because most people already know who Sicard is. I'm sure some people here today know. Well, it seems that Parisians didn't really care for Sicard. They weren't a fan. And Carlin hated him. So, as you can tell through these different examples, the conversation between these three, again, really varied in topics. They talked about medicine, dates, personal fears, family. They talked about Sicard a bit. And this conversation is a very important artifact because it shows an unfiltered version of this conversation happening in the 19th century. With letters, it's a bit different because you have time to edit letters. I can write one, sit down, think about what I want to say, maybe over the course of a day or two, and then if I'm not happy with it, I can rip it up and start over. And then, you send the letter, it arrives to the other person, they get it, they think about how they want to respond, make edits and revisions to it, and then mail it back. So that's how that process typically works. But with a conversation, it's in the moment, it's unfiltered, it's person to person. In a close proximity, you're in face to face with this person. So you're not separated by time or proximity. I'm sure that during these conversations, they had various facial expressions and gestures, like in the example with the deer when they were playing outside with the sun and the deer. There's probably gestures along with that. And as deaf people know, it's not possible to write every single thing down. So there are some missing pieces to this, but just keep in mind that, Carlin accepted this way of communication and the Sewards were happy with it, and they had this great friendship. Now, if Carlin was with a group of deaf people, he wouldn't be missing out on these things. He would get all the nuances, but hanging out with the Sewards, he's in a house full of hearing people. He's the only deaf one. Even the servants were hearing. So it's interesting to see this unfiltered look at how he communicated with this hearing world. I'm going to show you one more paragraph from this conversation and see what you think. Examine the language that he uses about sign language. So Carlin asks Henry, straight up, he says, "Do you think that hearing people are more intelligent than deaf people?" And Henry responds as follows. So Henry responds and says, "No, not at all. Education is the important part, and exposure. Doesn't matter if it's spoken and with English or through sign language, the important part is having access to communications." And this is really interesting because, again, this is an unfiltered, blunt response from Henry. He didn't have to, think about how to eloquently state this. This is how he feels. And he's, upper middle class white male with privilege. But these are his thoughts, and he's not involved with the deaf community, but just his automatic gut response is, well, no, it really depends on education. So this handwritten communication is one artifact that we have. We also have years and years of letters from 1842 to 1874. And they stayed friends for a long time. Now, Carlin did leave to travel around the world because being an artist, he couldn't stay in one place for a long time. But their friendship didn't dissolve over the years. They always, wrote letters back and forth and informed each other of updates on their life. And then even after Frances and her husband passed away, Carlin still kept in contact with their son. So we have all of these letters, and it's really a complete glimpse or total picture of this friendship between these deaf and hearing people back in the 19th century. And it shows how deaf people navigated the world, especially a hearing world. So on this slide, I have some takeaway points. So one point I have is, why should we care about this? Well, we get a first-hand, up-close, in-your-face look into their friendship. And it shows how deaf people built these bridges and connected with the hearing world. So it gives an important perspective. Now, Carlin met the Sewards in 1842. And again, he was an artist. And as photography became more and more popular, his work as a painter really started to diminish. So in one of these letters, you can see Carlin expresses his concerns and his struggles, and he explains, I can't support my family because of the photography business. And he really opens up and shares his struggles with Seward through this letter with his hearing friend. Here's some other things we can learn from this. It was interesting. When I was reading through these letters, I was waiting for the Sewards to ask Carlin, do you mind speaking? Do you mind using your voice? I want to hear your voice. But throughout all of the communication and letters, not once do the Sewards ask Carlin to speak using his voice. They were just willing to accept that Carlin preferred to use sign language and write back and forth. And it's easy for hearing people to just expect deaf people to lip read, but they were willing to have this friendship and write back and forth and match the communication of their deaf friend back in the 19th century. For those of us in deaf studies, I'm sure we all know that often deaf history focuses on deaf education, deaf employment, the controversy and struggle between manualism as opposed to oralism. So that's the typical topics in deaf history. Now, in hearing history, back in the 19th century, one example is by historian Cassandra Good. She's done numerous studies on the relationships between men and women during that time. And another individual, Nancy Cott, they've done studies on white middle-class women and how they develop bonds and sisterhood and womanhood. And this is back in the 19th century. So we examine those types of friendships. But then you notice there's no link to that among deaf and hearing friendships in the 19th century. There's no evidence as to how deaf and hearing people communicated. So finally, with these letters, it broadens our understanding of these relationships and the deaf experience during the 19th century. Now we have a but. There is a but that often happens. So during my time reading these conversations, I noticed, wow, there's so much equality. This is wonderful. They're peers. And I wrote my paper, and I was just so happy to see the equality in this friendship. But then I found this letter. It's from Frances to her sister, just between the two of them. So while Carlin was visiting, Frances sent a letter to her sister. And as you can see up here, this is what it mentions. She mentions loving to help people and taking care of Carlin. And the sister says, well, would you like him as much if he could talk? And she says, well, no, I just love the smile I bring to his face and helping him. So I do have to rewrite my paper. I have to. I need to throw out what I have and make sure to mention this because it's an important aspect. But what can we learn from this friendship? Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of benevolent paternalism. That means, taking care of, like a father. The concept that hearing people think that they need to guide and help deaf people, and hearing people know what's best for deaf people. That's the idea of benevolent paternalism. And this happens often in schools and academic settings, but now we can see that transfer into a social aspect. It transfers into their friendship. Now, Carlin is an adult. He's independent, he's successful, he meets these two friends, and it should just be like three adults meeting, right? He moves up the social ladder. He's just a regular guy. They write back and forth these letters. But now you have to look at this through the 19th century lens. So again, benevolent paternalism just really is meshed in with the deaf experience in the 19th century. Even outside of an academic setting, you saw this in social settings. Now, Carlin was educated. He hung out with these people. He went into their home. He sat at their table. They were really close friends. They were family. But Carlin could never become their peer, their equal peer. In the Seward's eyes, and through this 19th century lens, they were paternal figures to him.